There is a man whose existence has been debated more fiercely than any other figure in human history. More books have been written about him than about any other person who ever lived. More wars have been fought in his name. More hospitals built, more art commissioned, more music composed, more lives changed, all in the name of a man who left no writings of his own, no confirmed portrait, no verified tomb, and whose existence some scholars in the 20th century argued could not be historically proven at all. His name, in the language he actually spoke, was Yeshua. We know him as Jesus. And the question of whether he actually existed, not whether he was divine, not whether he rose from the dead, but whether he was a real human being who walked real roads in a real province of the Roman Empire in the first century of the Common Era, is a question that deserves a more serious answer than it usually gets from either side of the argument. Welcome to the channel where ancient secrets meet modern questions. Most people assume that the historical existence of Jesus is either blindingly obvious or completely unprovable, depending on which side of the argument they are already on. Neither assumption is correct. The evidence for a historical Jesus is real, substantial, and taken seriously by the overwhelming majority of scholars who study the ancient world, including scholars who are not Christian, including scholars who are atheist, including scholars whose entire professional interest is in finding what is historically reliable rather than what is theologically convenient. At the same time, the evidence is not what most Christians imagine it to be. It does not include eyewitness accounts. It does not include contemporary documents written during Jesus' lifetime. It does not include the kind of independent, corroborating, multiply-attested historical record that we have for figures like Julius Caesar or Augustus. What it includes is something more complicated, more interesting, and more revealing about how history actually works. For people who were not emperors or generals, people who were poor, provincial, and executed before anyone with resources thought they were worth writing about. To understand the evidence, you have to understand the world that produced it. First century Galilee and Judea were backwater provinces of the Roman Empire. Galilee, where Jesus grew up, was a region of small villages and subsistence farmers, a place where literacy was low and the production of written documents was almost non-existent among ordinary people. The Romans wrote extensively about the provinces they governed, but they wrote about what mattered to Roman administration: taxes, military campaigns, major political events, the behavior of client kings. A carpenter's son from a village called Nazareth, preaching to crowds in rural Galilee, would not have appeared in Roman administrative records. This is not suspicious. This is how ancient history works for almost everyone who was not already powerful before they became significant. We have no contemporary written sources for Socrates either. Everything we know about Socrates comes from writers who knew him or wrote about him after his death. The absence of contemporary sources for Jesus is not evidence of non-existence. It is evidence that he was, until very close to his death, a provincial Jewish preacher whose activities did not register on the radar of people with the resources to write things down. What we do have, and what the historical argument rests on, falls into several distinct categories. We have the letters of Paul, which are the oldest Christian documents that survive and which were written within 20 years of the crucifixion. We have the four Gospels, written between 40 and 70 years after the crucifixion, which contain material that historians can examine for historical reliability. We have references to Jesus in non-Christian sources, Roman and Jewish, that were written within a century of his death. And we have the archaeological record of first century Galilee and Judea, which does not prove that Jesus existed, but which confirms the world the gospel accounts describe with remarkable precision. Each of these categories of evidence has its own strengths and its own limitations, and understanding both is essential to understanding what we actually know. Paul is the starting point because Paul is the earliest. His letter to the Galatians, most scholars date to around 48 or 49 of the Common Era, less than 20 years after the crucifixion, which most historians place around 30 or 33 CE. In that letter, Paul mentions that he traveled to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion specifically to visit Cephas, the Aramaic name for Peter, and that he also met James, whom he describes as the Lord's brother. This is a remarkable detail. Paul is claiming personal acquaintance with a man he identifies as the biological brother of Jesus. He is not writing this for posterity. He is writing it to a community in Galatia in the middle of a dispute about his authority, and he is using his direct contact with James as evidence of his connection to the movement's leadership. This is exactly the kind of incidental, non-theological detail that historians treat as a marker of authenticity, a detail included not to make a doctrinal point, but to establish a personal credential, the kind of thing you would only write if the person you were describing actually existed and was actually known to your audience. Paul also writes in his first letter to the Corinthians that he delivered to them what he himself had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Scholars who study this passage carefully note that the formula Paul uses, that he received this and passed it on, is the technical language of Jewish oral tradition, the language used for transmitting authoritative teachings from teacher to student. And the content of this formula, including the reference to witnesses, most of whom are still alive, places its origin within a few years of the crucifixion at the very most. Paul is describing a tradition that had already been formalized before he wrote it down, a tradition that was already being transmitted in a specific, structured way, a tradition that explicitly invites verification. Go and ask the 500 people who were there. Most of them are still alive. This is not the language of mythology. This is the language of a man who believes he is transmitting historical information and who knows that the people he is writing to can check it. The Gospels are more complicated as historical sources, and any honest treatment of the evidence has to acknowledge that complexity. They are not eyewitness accounts. The scholarly consensus is that none of the four Gospels was written by one of the 12 disciples. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were attached to these texts in the 2nd century, long after they were composed. They were written in Greek, while Jesus' original disciples almost certainly spoke Aramaic and may not have been literate in Greek at all. They were written decades after the events they describe, in communities that had theological interests in how those events were portrayed. All of this is true. And yet, historians do not discard the Gospels as sources. They analyze them the way they analyze any ancient text, looking for the criteria that help distinguish historically reliable material from material that has been shaped by later theological development. The most important of these criteria is the criterion of multiple attestation. Details that appear in multiple independent sources are more likely to be historical than details that appear in only one. The crucifixion of Jesus under Pontius Pilate, for example, is attested in Paul's letters, in all four Gospels, in the Roman historian Tacitus, in the Jewish historian Josephus, and in early Christian texts outside the canonical New Testament. No serious historian doubts that the crucifixion happened. Another important criterion is the criterion of embarrassment. Details that would have been embarrassing to early Christians and that they would have had no reason to invent are more likely to be historical. The baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist is considered historically reliable by most scholars precisely because it is theologically awkward. It implies that Jesus was subordinate to John, that he needed to be cleansed of sin, that he was a follower before he was a leader. The gospel writers handle this awkwardness in different ways, but none of them omits the baptism, which suggests they could not because it was too well known to deny. The criterion of coherence asks whether a detail fits with what we know about the historical context from other sources. Here, the Gospels pass a remarkable number of tests that were not verifiable until relatively recently. The village of Capernaum, described in the Gospels as a base of operations for Jesus' Galilean ministry, has been excavated extensively since the 1960s. Archaeologists have found a first-century synagogue whose stone floor sits directly above a basalt floor from an even earlier building, a building that later excavations identified as a house with a room that by the 4th century had been converted into a place of Christian worship. A mosaic inscription from that church, dating to the Byzantine period, identifies the site as the house of Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples. This does not prove that Jesus healed people in that house, as the Gospels claim, but it does prove that a very early Christian tradition associated a specific building in Capernaum with Peter, a tradition consistent enough that a church was built over it within 3 centuries of the events described. The pool of Bethesda, mentioned in the Gospel of John as a place where Jesus healed a paralyzed man, was for a long time doubted by scholars who thought it might be a theological invention. Excavations near the Church of St. Anne in Jerusalem in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed a pool complex that matches John's description with striking specificity, including the 5 porticos John mentions, an unusual architectural feature that the text describes and that archaeology has now confirmed. The Pool of Siloam, mentioned in John as a place where Jesus sent a blind man to wash, was definitively identified in 2004 when construction workers accidentally exposed its stone steps during sewer repair work in Jerusalem. These are not proofs that the miracles described at these locations occurred. They are confirmations that the gospel writers were describing real places that they or their sources knew, places that archaeology has now verified. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who, according to all 4 Gospels, ordered the crucifixion of Jesus, was for a long time known only from the New Testament and from the writings of Josephus and Tacitus. In 1961, an Italian archaeologist named Antonio Frova, excavating the ancient Roman city of Caesarea Maritima on the Israeli coast, found a limestone block that had been reused as a step in a later construction. The inscription on the block, partially damaged, clearly reads in Latin, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. This is the only physical archaeological evidence ever found that directly mentions Pilate by name. It does not mention Jesus, but it confirms that Pilate held the exact title and position that the gospel accounts assigned to him, and it confirms this from Roman physical evidence completely independent of any Christian source. The non-Christian literary sources for Jesus are fewer than most people expect and more significant than skeptics typically acknowledge. The most important is Tacitus, the Roman historian writing around 116 of the Common Era, who in his annals describes the great fire that burned much of Rome under Nero in 64 CE. Tacitus explains that Nero blamed the fire on a group called Christians, and then in a passage that reads as parenthetical and aside for readers who might not know who Christians were, he writes that the name comes from Christus, who suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Tacitus is not a Christian source. Tacitus is a Roman aristocrat with a generally contemptuous view of what he calls the superstition of Christianity. He describes it as a destructive superstition that broke out again and spread not only through Judea, where it originated, but even to Rome. This is not a man with any interest in confirming the claims of Christian theology. But he confirms from Roman records that he had access to as a senior official that a man called Christus was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. This corroborates the core historical claim of the gospel accounts without any dependence on Christian sources whatsoever. Pliny the Younger, writing around 112 CE to the Emperor Trajan about how to handle Christians in the province he governed, describes people who gather before dawn and sing hymns to Christ as to a god, who take oaths not to commit crimes, and who share a common meal. Pliny is not describing theology. He is describing social practice, the actual behavior of actual people in an actual Roman province who organize their lives around devotion to a figure called Christ. His letter is administrative correspondence, not religious writing, and it confirms that communities organized around the memory and worship of Jesus existed within 80 years of the crucifixion in regions far from Judea. The evidence from Josephus is more complicated because the main passage in his Jewish antiquities that mentions Jesus, the Testimonium, Flavianum, has clearly been altered by later Christian scribes who wanted to make the Jewish historian sound more enthusiastic about Jesus than he actually was. The passage as it appears in the standard text calls Jesus a wise man, says he was the Christ, and describes his resurrection as a reappearance on the third day as the divine prophets had foretold. Most scholars are confident that a Jewish historian with no interest in Christian theology would not have written these things, and that Christian copyists in the early centuries added them. This is not unusual. In the manuscript tradition of ancient texts, scribal additions and alterations are well documented, but the existence of the interpolations does not mean the original passage said nothing. Most scholars who have analyzed the textual history of the Testimonium conclude that Josephus did write something about Jesus in this section, that the interpolated phrases can be identified and removed, and that what remains is a reference consistent with how Josephus discusses other Jewish figures. A brief, neutral, factual mention of a man who attracted followers and was executed. Josephus also refers in a later passage that has not been seriously challenged as an interpolation to the execution of James, whom he describes as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. This passing reference, which uses the name Jesus only to identify which James is meant, is exactly the kind of incidental mention that historians find most reliable, because no one would fabricate a reference to Jesus just to identify someone else. What does all of this add up to? Not proof in the mathematical sense. History does not work in proofs. History works in probability, in the accumulation of evidence from multiple independent sources, in the assessment of whether a proposed historical figure explains the evidence better than the alternative hypothesis that the figure did not exist. And the alternative hypothesis for Jesus, the mythicist position, the argument that Jesus was entirely a literary or theological invention with no historical human being at the base, faces a fundamental problem that its proponents have never satisfactorily resolved. If Jesus never existed, someone needs to explain Paul. Paul writes within 20 years of the crucifixion. He claims personal acquaintance with James, the brother of Jesus. He transmits a tradition about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus that was already formalized before he received it, which pushes its origin to within a few years of the events described. He names living witnesses who can be questioned. He describes his own experience of the risen Jesus as something that happened to him personally, not as something he read or heard as a myth. And he writes all of this to communities that included people who had known Jesus's disciples directly. If Jesus was a myth invented by a community of believers, Paul's letters are inexplicable, not difficult, inexplicable. The mythicist position is not taken seriously by the mainstream of ancient history scholarship. This is not a matter of religious bias among academics. The scholarly community includes atheists and agnostics and people of every background. It is a matter of how the evidence fits together. The overwhelming consensus of historians who study the ancient world is that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person, a Jewish preacher from Galilee, baptized by John the Baptist, active in Galilee and Judea during the reign of Tiberius, crucified under Pontius Pilate around 30 or 33 of the Common Era. Everything beyond that, his divine nature, his miracles, his resurrection, falls outside the methodological tools of historical inquiry, and historians, as historians, cannot evaluate those claims. But the man existed, and the evidence for his existence is, by the standards of ancient history, substantial. What makes this evidence interesting is not just what it confirms, but what it reveals about how history works at the margins of power. Jesus left no writings. No one who knew him personally wrote about him during his lifetime. He was executed as a criminal by an empire that had no reason to preserve his memory. And yet, within a generation of his death, communities organized around his memory existed from Jerusalem to Rome. Within 2 generations, Roman officials were writing to the emperor about the administrative problem these communities created. Within 3 generations, a Roman historian was describing the execution of their founder as an established historical fact. Within 4 centuries, the religion that emerged from those communities had become the official religion of the empire that executed him. This trajectory from anonymous provincial execution to the center of Western civilization is one of the most astonishing stories in human history, and it begins with a real man in a real province, in a real moment of Roman imperial history whose existence the evidence does not seriously allow us to doubt. The question that history cannot answer, the question that has divided humanity for 2,000 years, is what kind of man he was, whether the tomb was empty on the third day, whether the encounters the disciples described were real, whether the claims made about him in the Gospels are claims that transcend what history can evaluate, or claims that history has already quietly refuted. That question is not going away. It has not gone away in 20 centuries, and the evidence we have examined today does not resolve it. What it does is establish the ground beneath it. The man was real. The execution was real. The movement that emerged from his death was real. And the world was changed by all three in ways that are still being felt today by billions of people on every continent, in every language, in every culture that the last 2,000 years of human history have produced. What does it mean to you, knowing that the historical case for Jesus is stronger than most skeptics admit and weaker than most believers assume? Leave your answer in the comments. That tension between what the evidence establishes and what faith claims is the most interesting space in all of religious history. And next time we go into the evidence for something even more contested, the resurrection. Not the theological claim, the historical question. What actually happened in Jerusalem in the days after the crucifixion? And what does the evidence examined honestly and without an agenda actually allow us to say? That investigation is coming. Do not miss it. There is one more dimension of the evidence that deserves its own space, the evidence that comes not from texts, but from people, from the sociology of a movement. Because one of the most compelling arguments for the historical existence of Jesus is not a document or an inscription or an excavated building. It is the behavior of the people who claim to have known him. The disciples of Jesus, the men and women who, according to the gospel accounts, spent years with him in Galilee and Jerusalem, did not respond to the crucifixion the way people typically respond to the death of a movement's founder. When a messianic leader was killed by Rome, and Rome killed several of them in the first century, as the historian Josephus records, the movement almost always collapsed. The followers dispersed. They went back to their villages. They accepted that the man they had followed was not, after all, the one they had hoped for. This is what happened when Theudas was killed, when the Egyptian prophet was killed, when Simon of Perea was killed. The movement died with the man. But the followers of Jesus did not disperse. Within weeks of the crucifixion, they were in Jerusalem, publicly claiming that he had risen from the dead. Within months, they had established a community there. Within years, they had spread to Syria, to Asia Minor, to Greece, to Rome. They did this in the face of active persecution. They did this at considerable personal cost. Several of them, according to both Christian and non-Christian sources, died for what they claimed. People die for things they believe to be true. This is not by itself evidence that what they believe is actually true. History is full of people who died for false beliefs, sincerely held. But it is evidence of sincere belief. The disciples were not, on the available evidence, cynical inventors of a story they knew to be false. They were people who claimed to have experienced something, the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb, the encounters described in the gospel accounts that transformed their despair into a conviction that no amount of social pressure or physical threat could dislodge. Whatever happened, something happened. Something that produced in a group of first century Jewish peasants a certainty so absolute that they rebuilt their entire lives around it and maintained that certainty until the end of their lives. The historian N.T. Wright, in his exhaustive study of the resurrection tradition, argues that the emergence of resurrection belief in the specific form it takes in early Christianity cannot be explained by the religious environment of first century Judaism. Jewish belief in resurrection existed. It was an established expectation in Pharisaic tradition, but it was always a collective end of history event. The resurrection of a single individual in the middle of history before the general resurrection at the end of the age was not a category that existed in Jewish thought. No one was expecting it. No one had a theological template ready to receive it. The claim the disciples made was not a natural development of existing Jewish belief. It was a rupture, something that required a specific, unprecedented experience to generate. Wright's argument does not prove the resurrection happened, but it does establish that the belief in it cannot be explained as the natural evolution of Jewish eschatology without some triggering event. Something happened in Jerusalem after the crucifixion that produced a claim nobody was expecting and that nobody had a prior reason to invent: the women. Here is a detail that almost every treatment of the historical evidence for Jesus discusses, because it is exactly the kind of detail that historians treat as a strong marker of authenticity. In all four gospel accounts, it is women, Mary Magdalene, and others who are the first witnesses of the empty tomb and the first to report the resurrection. In the social world of first century Judaism, women's testimony was not considered legally valid. A writer inventing a resurrection story to persuade a Jewish audience would have given that role to men, to Peter, to John, to figures whose testimony would carry weight. The fact that all four Gospels name women as the first witnesses is exactly the kind of detail that historians trust most, the kind no one invents because it works against you. You report it because too many people already know it, and you cannot change what actually happened.